Hi, and welcome back to Sum It Up, where we plan to summit a big topic together with you today, and that is the nonprofit financial crisis. My name is Joelle Martinez. I'm president and CEO of the Latino Leadership Institute, and I am again joined by my friend and colleague, Harry Hollins, our Chief Strategy Officer, and someone I'm delighted to dig into this topic with because of the expertise and insight that he brings. When thinking about the nonprofit sector and specifically the nonprofit financial crisis, I've thought about the reach and impact and the importance and the urgency around this conversation. Not only because the Latino Leadership Institute is a nonprofit trying to navigate this moment and trying to figure out new financial strategies for sustainability, not just in today's moment, but for the long haul. But I took a step back, and I know I shared this with Harry earlier in the week, that when you look at our 57,000 network members of the LLI, at least 40% of those members today are leading nonprofit organizations as executive directors, as program officers, as board members, and even on the foundation side, on the funding side. And then I took a step back. I thought about the jobs that they employ at their nonprofit organizations. I thought about the economic development and mobility that they are responsible for, whether it's their scholarship funds or housing projects that they work on or access to higher education. Each of those are creating economic opportunities. They're closing gaps in the community. Nonprofit organizations impact everyone's life in one way or another, as healthcare providers, as direct service providers, as education providers. And so this discussion today is a really important one because nonprofits today are about 10% of the entire US workforce. They contribute about 1.5 trillion every year to the GDP. In fact, about 6% of our US GDP comes from the nonprofit sector. Although oftentimes we think of nonprofit not through a business, economic, and financial lens. And I think, Harry, you'll agree with me that today's discussion is to really focus in on those points because nonprofit organizations aren't, just do-good organizations. They're an economic engine, both for what we do on the ground, but for how we operate. So I want to start there, Harry, with you today. When we think and talk about this nonprofit financial crisis, what does that mean to you? How do you describe that to others who aren't living our day-to-day lives as nonprofit leaders?
Joel, I describe it as very challenging to dire. Like those are the two fence posts. And if you are a Latino or Black-led organization, I would say it's dire or very close to dire. And I say that because of the level of financial and operational crisis that many of us are dealing with right now, which is a combination of historical challenges and current challenges. And I think we have to talk about kind of how we got here, and then also talk about the moment that we're in. But you think about the past decade and probably longer, access to capital, access to financial resources has been indefensible. Like we start with, somewhere in the range of 4 to 10% of philanthropic dollars go to Latino and Black-led organizations in the nonprofit sector. And if you're a Latina or if you're a Black woman, it's about 2%. And so that's really important to keep in mind. And you look at the overall sector, and 70 to 80% of nonprofits are white-led, even organizations that are focused in our community. And when you look at nonprofits that are top 300 in terms of revenue and size, it's about 90%. So we absolutely still have a representation problem. We have an access to funding problem and challenge. And then you add a new set of challenges that we're dealing with right now, which is less access to funding and resources from some really important agencies, some really important places, the Small Business Administration, SBA, and we can talk about that, the Community Development Financial Institutions, CDFIs, the Minority Business Development Agency. These were key agencies that provided funding plus tools plus resources. And right now we're on a path for them to have less of that, which means they'll be less available to organizations that service, really vulnerable parts of the community. And that recipe, you take it all together. And Joel, to answer your question, I think you have an extremely vulnerable sector that has immense pressure on fundraising, and the government, whether it's local, state, or federal, has been a key resource to the nonprofit sector. 2 out of 3 nonprofits across the United States have some level of support from the government. And then we could talk about not having cash reserves to weather storms. And you could say that we're in a storm now, and that's requiring us to take a very short-term look, which can come at the expense of long-term planning. And so I think that's how I think about the whole thing. But one thing I want to ask you about it, because you sit in a very unique position. I talked about how few organizations are Latina-led. You have seen a lot over your 10 years, your decade of work, leading the Latino Leadership Institute. And love to hear you talk about your experience leading as a Latina and your experience in fundraising as a leader of a nonprofit.
Yeah. So this question is hard, and you know that there have been many experiences in the 10 years leading as a nonprofit leader, Latina, and it comes down to, I think, how and why I think this financial crisis came to be, and amplifies what you said. Less than 2% of funding goes to Latina-led organizations that are doing good work, and built into that are systemic barriers. Biases, I think about the statistic that we are less likely to get general operating funds than our white-led organizations. And why is that? What level of scrutiny is being put under us? What do we have to prove to get the funding in the first place? When we take a step back and we think about the nonprofit sector as a whole, the ecosystem has been vulnerable for a really long time. I think it's been on shaky grounds. We experienced it during COVID, right? When so many of our nonprofit organizations put events as one of their major revenue strategies, and then the events went away and nonprofits were scrambling to figure out how they were going to, supplement those dollars. I think about the fact that when I go into these funding pitches and I come with big ideas, I think about the fact that they're questioning whether or not I'll actually be able to pull those off, and the amount of hoops I have to go through in order to get that funding. I think about the paperwork that goes along with a $25,000 grant, and with a small staff, how it's realistic to even, do that amount of work for those few dollars. But I gotta tell you, the thing that bothers me the most, Harry, as a Latina leading a nonprofit, is the fact that they don't appreciate my sophistication with my business mindset. I have led the LLI from day one as a business who happens to be structured as a nonprofit focused on impact. But I look at things like earned revenue and program revenue and diversified revenue. And I got to tell you, foundations have criticized that sometimes, because we do have programmatic revenue, and because we look different than maybe some other nonprofits. But I think breaking some of those stereotypes and changing the way people think about us as leaders, and looking at us not as a risky investment, but a smart investment, is part of why the nonprofit system has been broken for a really long time. But one of the things you have helped me with as we've navigated this time together is understanding that we do have to have a business mindset, that we do have to put our financial position front and center in order to ensure that we're here for the long haul, and that we can actually create the impact that brings us here in the first place. So we are dealing with a major financial crisis today. Nonprofit organizations, to your point, rely heavily in some way, shape, or form on government funding. I think of it as a cascading problem, right? So as those federal funds begin to close or vanish entirely, and listen, we've experienced that personally and directly here at the LLI. Then you go and you look at the foundations or other funding opportunities to close those gaps. And you and I know there's not enough foundations out there to close those gaps. And then we have to look at other donors in order to close those gaps as well. The bottom line for us, I believe, is that there's just so many gaps, maybe too many gaps. So what are we doing at the LLI that we can share with others? And what do you suggest other nonprofits could be doing today in order to really establish some financial stability in order to have long-term vitality?
I think, Joel, there's a couple things, and you and I have talked about it a lot. And when I say these, I want to say that it's said with an understanding that this can come with impact to people and impact to fully execute on your mission and vision. And we don't take that lightly. These are really, really hard to talk about. But the first one would be, and we've had to do it, others had, is to not only restructure, but to start to implement what would be your most conservative models. That is really hard to do. And we've had really tough discussions about it. And that does mean it has impact on people. It does mean it has impact on the scale that you may be able to execute on the near term. But we do think in terms of the next 12 months, because ultimately our fiduciary duty is to fulfill our mission and our vision to serve our community. But there is some tough decisions we're having to make to try to ensure that we're here to do that and to weather what is this crisis we're in. Not exactly sure how short it is, but it's not going away tomorrow and it's not going away next month. And I do think you have to think in terms of the next 9 to 12 months and what your financial structure needs to look like is one. And two is the point you talked about, Joelle, and we always tried to have some level of earned revenue. And what's interesting in our space, and you talked about this kind of business mindset, or I'll call it a for-profit mindset, the largest, most successful nonprofits operate as companies and corporations. And I say that because a lot of them, 30 to 60% of their operational expenses are covered by earned revenue that they generate. So the second point would be to start to look at, can you build and test some earned revenue models? And the last point, and I know this is something you've always had, you've had it before I joined the organization, which is cash on hand is one of our most critical metrics that we look at. We track it monthly. We track it at the board level. It's a board requirement. We talk about it. And for anyone who doesn't know, that's literally how much cash do we have to maintain operations if all money stopped today? Mm-hmm. How long can we go to give us enough time to pivot, repivot? What can we talk about? And the reality is most nonprofits have 30 days or less of operating cash. And that is really problematic in this environment when you would like to have 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And you've always had that there. And I'll even ask you, even before I joined the organization, when and why did you implement that? And that is actually probably one of our most important metrics, along with our programmatic metrics.
Yeah. At the end of the day, that cash on hand, and this is why we're in this financial crisis. I really believe this, and this is the most important thing to amplify. Nonprofits today do not have a lot of cash on hand. And as I reached out to our network members that are leading amazing nonprofit organizations, nearly every single one of them reported back to me 30, 60, maybe 90 days cash on hand, meaning that if all money stopped today, that's how long they could keep their doors open and their work going. That actually keeps me up at night to think about, because to restart takes a lot. But the reason why I believe cash on hand has always been important for us is because we've never relied on just one set of funding. We've had foundation funding, we've had corporate funding, we've had major donor funding over the years. And there has always been a moment in time where one of those areas of funding has stopped. Truly, they've shifted priorities, or the person who was allocating our funding left. So that relationship building went away and that funding stopped. And I fundamentally believed that we would have to have money in the bank to keep us afloat when those situations happened. And I'll tell you, when we went into the COVID years and everything, kind of halted for us, having some cash on hand was a really important thing for us, but we didn't have enough. And the other thing that the LLI did during those COVID years is we went and got a loan. And I don't think nonprofits think about debt and having a line of credit nearly enough. And I'll be very transparent. What kept LLI up and running during those years was a line of credit loan. And we had to apply for it. And that's part of this crisis as well, is that they expect us to operate like a business, but a for-profit could go to a lender and show their revenue receipts and get themselves a line of credit to either expand their work or just keep their doors open. Nonprofits today don't have access to lines of credits. They don't have access. What are we going to take to a bank to show as our profit margins, right? And I think that's part of it. And we were very fortunate enough to find a lender that is specifically helping nonprofit organizations do it. But because cash on hand is so important to the operations of the organizations, we leveraged debt just like a for-profit would in order to keep our doors open as we were trying to build new programs, trying to look at new revenue streams, trying to shift our entire business model seemingly overnight during those years. And it took debt in order to do it. And we're still paying it off, but that's good debt to have. And that's one lesson I would give to other nonprofits out there today. And, I think about this financial crisis and the revenue, and you came from the private sector, Harry. And so I think in addition to having that cash on hand, what are some ways that you think other nonprofits could be looking at earned revenue as a solution?
I think there's a couple. I think you have to go through what is your programmatic capability now, and are there opportunities you to create some for fee services would be one. And then of course the events, and we've done it. You talked about earned revenue. We've used events to plan and to help us weather storms, and it's been part of a diversified revenue stream. So I think part of it is sitting down and literally writing down every asset that you have as a single asset and figuring out how you can optimize that asset with the mindset that it's okay to generate revenue. And in fact, Joelle, we've talked to a number of organizations who didn't know they could actually, as a nonprofit, they could actually have revenue. And it's amazing. You can actually have revenue. It's about what you do with the revenue. It has to be reinvested back into the operations, but you can have cash, you can build cash on hand to build sustainability for yourself. But it's a very different way of looking at it. And it's leading with, I can't serve my mission and vision if I'm not here. And I got to build my model around that. And then think longer. A lot of us think 6 months, 12 months, and that's it. When we should be thinking, and come in the for-profit sector, minimal windows are 2 and 3 years out. And not that you don't make adjustments and pivots along the way, but when we model out that far, and we know we have to, make changes and make pivots and things happen in the marketplace. But it is a very different mindset, and it's understanding it's okay to do that. And that last point you raised on the debt, we've had a lot of organizations didn't know they could do that, and they get nervous around it. When in many instances, it's some of the best money you can get if you structure it right. If it's a long term, if you're building out earned revenue, if you have a low interest rate and you have the right payback and you align that to your business and your go-to-market strategy, it can be an incredible instrument to have. Yeah. And so I think there's a lot of things you could do there. Then Joelle, we talk a lot about what can we do. There also on the other side needs to be changes within the sector and the ecosystem.
That's the understanding.
And ask you, let's also talk about the philanthropic space on the other side that is there to support us and what needs to happen over there.
Yeah. So I think I'm just going to be real, because that's what these conversations are all. I do not believe that the nonprofit sector is built for long-term sustainability for our communities. And I'm just being as real as I possibly can. and the vulnerabilities that we are seeing in this moment because of our reliance, not just on government funding, but our reliance on the philanthropic funding. And I'm seeing questions, and I received questions before today, like, where do we get money? How do we get money from foundations? And I'm just going to be honest. If that is the only question we're asking, then our long-term sustainability is highly at risk, because we are not going to change the foundation's mindsets overnight. I mean, the fact that Latina-led organizations get 2% and Latino and Black organizations combined got 4% going into this crisis, right there shows you that the system is broken. Because more money, I mean, that would be the answer, right? More access to capital, more money needs to flow into our communities. But the reality is that foundations, if we rely on foundations solely, they dictate the extent of our work. They dictate the longevity of the work. They dictate the impact, because they can change their economic focus overnight, and we would lose funding. And that's happened to us, time and time again. They right now are labeling a lot of work in communities of color, and particularly, as DEI. And so therefore we're a risk investment right now, when, to be honest, our work is not DEI, it's economic mobility. It's economic in every way, shape, and form. And the foundations need to also stay course with their race-based funding, something that Hispanics in Philanthropy came out. We can't abandon those investments. It would be devastating to the communities that need them the most. But at the end of the day, I think we got to go beyond foundations. We have to find mechanisms for long-term financial sustainability. And quite frankly, I think we got to broaden from foundations to major donors. And at the end of the day, even when I've served on other boards, the reality has been true for 10 years. There are less donors today than there were a decade ago. So fewer people are donating. That's a problem. More importantly, for the Latino community, Latino major donors have to be activated and be part of the investment into the infrastructure, and being able to get those dollars out of those donors, in addition to really compelling foundations to keep giving race-based, community-based investments, and major donors. And one final thing, whether you are a corporate funder, a philanthropic funder, or a major donor, the dollars that nonprofits need today are general operating. Part of the reason that most organizations don't have the ability to pivot, that don't have the ability to keep their staff when it does come down to survival mode, is because their dollars are tied to programmatic deliverables. Some grants that you and I have applied for and gotten over the years didn't even allow us to put some of that money to personnel. I wonder how the hell we do our work if we can't have staff. I mean, this is something that I know keeps us up at night. So foundations, donors, major donors, they have to be able to trust us. It's just like trust-based investments, just like anything else. You have to trust the organizations to do the work, and you have to open general operating dollars. And that's true across all funding, all types of funders, in my opinion. So I think it's a combination of all of those things. I don't know, Harry, you write as many grant proposals as I do. What are your thoughts there?
I think too, on two sides. And one comment I just saw as you were talking, Joelle, that came in, and one thing that I did miss, someone mentioned the importance of partnerships. Mm-hmm. And one thing you and I've talked about, and I've been screaming this in my 6 years we've known each other, and at some point I hope this is a change we make on the nonprofit side. Consolidation. Yeah. We talk about it. The reality is, and we have to be honest here, there's too many nonprofits in the United States. There's like 1.8 million. Last stat I heard, there was 40 nonprofits per every zip code in the United States. Yep. We're in each other's backyard doing the exact same good work, but there is power in coming together. There is power in synergies in combining talent, expertise, and resources. And it's something we never talk about. You would never see this in the for-profit space. I'm not making a direct analogy, but I'll tell you, never see a space this crowded, because they would start to take those that are doing great work and bring them together, and one can't equal three. And I would tell everyone listening, if you go back and just look up and do some research in the last decade of where nonprofits have merged, you're going to find an incredible success rate where together there's been more capability to deliver deeper products and services at a lower cost and build faster earned revenue streams. So we have models that it's worked. We just, we don't talk about it enough. So I'd say that on one side. On the other side, you touch on, Joel, is with the foundations, it's not like we can expect some magical change overnight. But one thing I do think, and I would say this to any foundation, is please open your doors. And what I mean by opening your doors is twofold. One, a lot of foundations only accept a request if it's an invite. The reason we opened up with the numbers we're dealing with is there's so few of us, a lot of us, and I mean us meaning the nonprofits led by Latinos, led, Black-led organizations, is we don't have the social capital and the relationships to be invited to the table. So we can't even make, a bid, an application for a grant. You don't know who we are because we can't get in the door to even introduce ourselves. And on the second side, the moment we're in, the grant cycles don't align with reality, and we need foundations to open up to some rolling capability to apply on the fly and get funding on the fly, as opposed to stringent dates. Because we're not in a situation where we can operate under those hard dates right now, and that can be done. And so I've heard a lot of foundations say that we're in planning mode. Well, it's been a month, and you just mentioned we have a lot of foundations with 30 to 60 days of operating cash. So when we talk about urgency, it is now, and we do need foundations to at least be a little bit more flexible across the country for the moment that we're in.
Yeah, I want to amplify this social capital, and we are living this. Like everything that Harry and I are talking about with all of you today are the exact things that LLI is either experiencing or doing. So, we come at this with a business mindset. We come at this with, strong financial planning. We come at this knowing that what will work for us will work for others. And this issue of social capital is so critically important in funding. Listen, at the basic level, this is how money flows. And whether we're talking in the private sector or for our entrepreneurs or in our nonprofit sector, we are all trying to figure out how to get the money to flow where it needs to flow, when it needs to flow. And a lot of your major foundations, and even quite frankly, your local foundations, the folks that get money have access to the foundations, the boards, the executive directors, the program officers. The program officers are gatekeepers, and you've got to create relationships with these program officers. I mean, they decide right away whether or not they're going to advocate for you or not. And if you don't have those relationships, if you don't have the social capital, if you're not on the short list of being invited to apply, those dollars are never going to flow to you. Really important dollars. And it makes you wonder, well, if they're not flowing to you, who are they flowing to? And that comes back to the ones that have the social capital. So again, we are not just talking about it, we're doing it. So what did Harry and I do over the last several weeks? We started calling, emailing, texting our friends in foundations and in philanthropy in general and said, do you know anyone at this organization? Can you make an introduction to us at this organization? At the end of the day, it comes back to what we fundamentally believe, that social capital opens up opportunities and access to money. It opens up access to the people that are making the decisions. And again, why we even started talking about Cumbre Connect all those years ago is because the reality is we get 2% of funding as Latinas because Latinas don't have access to where that funding is actually taking place. Access right now is critically important. It's something that we're working on, not only to keep LLI going, but so that we can crack the code, so that we can remove some of these barriers. Because if we can do it, we can show others how to do it as well. And this is also a call to our foundations and partners. There are so many good organizations out there doing the good work, and they're nowhere near on your radar. So how do we change that? How do we change how money is flowing into our communities? I just think that's such a critical point.
Yes, and we see it across from not only the foundations but corporate partners to board. It's all part of an ecosystem of who do you know, who you can introduce us to get into the front door for any organization. And I think it's a very reasonable ask and something that could be done within the ecosystem, especially at the corporate and the foundation level, because they do know who the decision makers are. And it's not asking, it's still just allow us to come in and present ourselves and then find out, do we think it's compelling to you? Do we fit within one of your investment pillars? But if the gatekeeping is we can't come in the front door, that's very difficult dealing with the other challenges already sitting in front of us.
Yeah, I do want to add, Esther and some others have asked questions about corporate fundraising, corporate foundations, and we actually do a lot from our corporate partners and corporate foundations. Listen, I do think that the corporate foundations, particularly with money flowing into our communities, is sometimes untapped, and companies, what we have found in the past for corporations is that they tend to give to events in our communities. So they sponsor a table, which events are good revenue because usually those are general operating dollars, which we're still going to continue to talk about. But those are usually smaller investments, 5, 10, maybe if you're lucky, $25,000 investments. And there's a lot of work. You don't net all those dollars because the event is actually quite expensive. Corporations like foundations have long grant cycles. You can usually only apply one time a year. And the challenge with corporations is they actually allocate their budget based on their profits the year before. So they've allocated their budgets. And at the end of the day, it's exactly what we were talking about on the foundation side. You got to know someone. You got to build the relationships. You got to be on their radar. The folks that lead the foundations, that lead those corporate dollars, they work usually with the same organizations year over year because those relationships have been developed. So if you want to expand into corporate foundations and corporate giving, the best way to do it is just the way we did it, which is you find the person who's responsible for the community allocation, community dollar allocations, the foundations. You email them, you LinkedIn them, and you start a relationship with them. But recognizing that those corporate dollars sometimes can take 12, 18, 24 months to be realized. So it comes down to what are we doing today? I think to sum it up for all of us on today's call, the financial crisis that our nonprofits find themselves in today is a historic one. The system was not set up for us to thrive, and I'm just being completely transparent about that. But the closing of opportunities of federal dollars and other government dollars is going to create a 30, 60-day, 90-day catastrophe because our nonprofits are not sitting on cash on hand, because we have not looked at earned revenue strategies yet. And all nonprofits today should be looking at survival mode. You have to spend less, reserve your cash until you've figured out your revenue streams for the long haul. And these are all the things LLI is doing. And then in addition, we have to compel our foundations to change the way they're doing business, to open up opportunities, to remove these barriers like access to social capital, and to invest in us in general operating funds. And so not tying it to dollars spent to programmatics today, but really allowing us to make the investments for the organization that we are qualified to make. And I think the final component that I would add, and then ask Harry to close us out today, is that we as a community need to collaborate. We do have to consolidate. There are too many nonprofits doing similar work, and there are going to be fewer dollars for us to fight over. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to actually go stronger as a sector by working together and not trying to compete in the way that we've been competing. Those are tough conversations sometimes to have, but I think the right conversation, if we want to establish long-term financial viability for our organizations individually, but for the sector holistically. But Harry, close us out today. When you want people to walk away, what's the most important piece of this for you from your perspective?
I think it's the mindset shift that we have within the sector and in the nonprofit space on how we operate. It is about our mission, our vision, our social good, but it also has to be about long-term longevity, which brings in a different mindset. Even when you talked about the corporate relationships, we always ask, love that you attach with our social good. What does this drive within your business? What does this do for your business? Otherwise, you're not going to have the stickiness and the long lasting relationship that could be built from it. So I think it's a mix there. It's bringing in a thinking of how am I going to be here 1, 2, 3 years out? It's not about just in that moment. So I think that mind shift is really critically important, and similar to all sectors that are in crisis right now. We saw it in COVID across all sectors, all marketplaces. Focus on getting through this calendar year first, financially, then quickly figure that, and that'll take it. And then while you're figuring that out, then you can start to think about what does 2026 look like right now. But I would say, as you said, just being brutally honest, it's not new avenues. We don't see new avenues opening up right now. We actually see avenues close and slow down. And the sector by design wasn't built to be nimble.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to first figure out and work on survival. And I think we shared some things we've done that hopefully would be helpful to weather this storm right now, and then start to think longer term.
Wonderful. All right, everyone. Could not agree with mindset shifting in this time we're navigating. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week on Sum It Up. Thanks, everyone.